The Vietnam War was not misunderstood. It was misrepresented, and the misrepresentation became the strategy. By 1967, American commanders were measuring success with numbers that had no relationship to victory, and everyone involved knew it. The body count system turned human death into a performance metric, and officers who questioned the accuracy of those counts were reassigned. Entire operations were designed not to hold territory or destroy enemy capability, but to generate favorable statistics for press briefings in Saigon. The war became a production line for data that contradicted itself across every level of command. Villages declared pacified in the morning were considered hostile by nightfall. Enemy strength estimates varied by tens of thousands, depending on which intelligence agency submitted the report. And the men walking through rice paddies and jungle were told their sacrifices were measurable, even as the measurements changed weekly. This was not confusion. This was policy. In 1965, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara initiated the automated battlefield concept, believing the war could be won through systems analysis and data optimization. He installed IBM engineers in Saigon to process combat reports like factory output. Every firefight, every airstrike, every killed or captured enemy was entered into databases designed to reveal patterns that ground commanders could not see. The problem was that the ground commanders were feeding the system false information, not out of malice, but because accurate reporting was punished. If a unit reported low enemy kills after a major operation, it suggested poor performance. If a unit reported high civilian casualties, it suggested recklessness. The optimal report was one that balanced enemy deaths with minimal friendly losses and avoided mentioning anything that could not be quantified. Entire battles were summarized in numerical abstracts that removed fear, confusion, and moral compromise from the equation. The data looked clean. The war did not. The Phoenix program was introduced in 1967 as a targeted neutralization campaign against Viet Cong infrastructure. Neutralization was the official term. It meant capture or kill, but capture required detention facilities, interrogation protocols, and legal oversight, all of which slowed operations. Kill was faster. Provincial reconnaissance units, often led by CIA officers and staffed with South Vietnamese soldiers and former Viet Cong defectors, were given quotas. A certain number of suspected VC operatives had to be neutralized each month to prove the program's effectiveness. The problem was identifying actual Viet Cong operatives in villages where loyalty was fluid and survival often required cooperation with both sides. Many of those neutralized were local officials, school teachers, or civilians accused by rivals or tortured informants. Some were Viet Cong, many were not. The program officially neutralized over 20,000 people by 1971. The number included an unknown percentage of misidentified targets, but there was no mechanism to distinguish between them after the fact. Dead suspects do not contest their designation. Operation Ranch Hand, the prolonged herbicide spraying campaign, was presented as a defoliation effort to remove enemy cover and destroy crops that fed Viet Cong units. Agent Orange and other chemical mixtures were sprayed over millions of acres, often in areas with no confirmed enemy presence. The operation was justified using maps that designated entire provinces as free fire zones, meaning anything inside them could be targeted without additional authorization. Pilots sprayed according to grid coordinates, not verified intelligence. Some areas were sprayed multiple times because the vegetation regrew or because records were incomplete. The health effects were not classified as a primary concern during the operation. Military physicians noted unusual skin conditions and respiratory problems among ground personnel in sprayed areas, but these observations were not compiled into actionable reports. The long-term effects on both Vietnamese civilians and American veterans were not acknowledged as service-related for decades. The operation continued until 1971, not because it achieved its objectives, but because it had become routine. The practice of falsifying body counts extended beyond individual units padding their numbers. High-level command briefings in Saigon required weekly kill ratios that demonstrated progress. When ground reports did not provide sufficient numbers, analysts used statistical modeling to estimate additional enemy deaths that likely occurred but were not directly observed. If an airstrike hit a suspected enemy position and no bodies were recovered, the kill count was calculated based on the tonnage of ordnance dropped and the estimated density of enemy troops in the target area. These estimated kills were reported as confirmed kills in summary documents sent to Washington. The system rewarded optimism and penalized accuracy. Officers who reported unfavorable ratios were questioned about their unit's aggressiveness. Officers who reported favorable ratios were promoted. By 1968, some units were counting civilian deaths as enemy combatants because the distinction had become unmanageable. A dead male of military age in a hostile area was classified as Viet Cong unless proven otherwise, and proof was rarely pursued. The Hamlet evaluation system was designed to measure pacification progress by rating each hamlet's security, economic development, and political loyalty on a scale from A to E. Teams of analysts visited hamlets, interviewed officials, and assigned scores based on standardized criteria. The problem was that security could change within hours. Economic development meant little in areas where markets were controlled by the Viet Cong, and political loyalty was performed rather than felt. Hamlet chiefs knew what answers would result in higher scores and more aid, so they provided those answers. Viet Cong operatives often held positions in hamlet governance and participated in the evaluation process. Some hamlets were rated secure during the day and used as Viet Cong staging areas at night. The system was not designed to capture this reality. It was designed to generate charts that showed improvement over time. The charts showed improvement. The hamlets remained contested. Free fire zones were areas where commanders authorized the use of all available firepower without regard to civilian presence. These zones were supposed to be evacuated before being designated, but evacuation was inconsistent and incomplete. Many civilians did not leave because they had nowhere to go, because they did not trust the South Vietnamese government, or because they did not receive notification. Others returned to retrieve belongings or tend to crops. Once an area was declared a free fire zone, anything that moved inside it could be engaged. Artillery units fired harassment and interdiction missions into these zones throughout the night, not at observed targets, but at grid coordinates chosen to disrupt enemy movement. Pilots dropped unused ordnance into free fire zones on return flights rather than landing with live bombs. The cumulative effect was the destruction of villages, farmland, and infrastructure in areas that may or may not have contained enemy forces. After the war, some free fire zones were found to have had significant civilian populations throughout the period they were being bombarded. The policy of search and destroy was based on the assumption that the enemy could be found, engaged, and eliminated through aggressive patrolling. Units were sent into areas with no intelligence, no clear objectives beyond making contact, and no plan for holding territory once contact was broken. Patrols walked until they were ambushed or until they found something to justify the operation. Once contact was made, overwhelming firepower was applied, the area was searched for bodies and weapons, and the unit moved on. The same areas were patrolled repeatedly because there was no occupation force to prevent the enemy from returning. Some landing zones were assaulted dozens of times over the course of the war. The operations produced casualties on both sides, but no permanent change in control. Ground was taken and abandoned in a cycle that lasted years. Soldiers began to understand that their presence was temporary and their impact minimal, but the operations continued. The use of napalm in close air support missions was standard procedure, but the targeting protocols were inconsistent. Napalm was dropped on villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong, on tree lines that might conceal snipers, and on areas where enemy troops had been reported hours or days earlier. The weapon doesn't distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, and in many cases, neither did the targeting process. Pilots received grid coordinates and descriptions like hostile village or suspected enemy concentration. They did not receive confirmation of enemy presence or civilian evacuation. Some strikes were called in by ground units under fire who could not see what they were marking. Other strikes were pre-planned as part of larger operations and executed regardless of real-time conditions. The results were filmed, catalogued, and used in training materials and promotional reels. But the human cost was abstracted into operational summaries that emphasized effectiveness and precision. The Winter-Spring Offensive of 1968, commonly called the Tet Offensive, was a catastrophic intelligence failure. American and South Vietnamese forces were caught unprepared, despite warnings from multiple sources. The warnings were dismissed because they contradicted prevailing assessments that the enemy was weakened and incapable of coordinated attacks. When the offensive began, it struck over 100 cities and towns simultaneously. The initial response was chaotic. Units fought without clear command structure. Civilians were caught in urban combat. The city of Hue was occupied for weeks and became a prolonged battle that devastated the historic center. After the offensive was repelled, American military leadership declared it a major victory because enemy casualties were high and the attacks were ultimately defeated. This was technically accurate. The offensive failed to trigger a general uprising and the Viet Cong lost significant manpower. But the psychological and political impact was the opposite of victory. The American public saw that the enemy could strike anywhere, that security was an illusion, and that official statements about progress were unreliable. The gap between reported success and visible reality became unbridgeable. The assignment of soldiers to Vietnam was based on a one-year rotation policy designed to maintain morale and distribute the burden of service. In practice, it created a constant turnover of inexperienced personnel and eliminated unit cohesion. Soldiers arrived, learned how to survive, and left, often just as they became effective. Units lost institutional knowledge continuously. Leadership positions were filled by officers rotating through for 6-month command tours intended to enhance their careers. Some commanders prioritized aggressive operations to build their records. Others avoided risk to ensure they completed their tours without incident. The soldiers under them understood that their survival depended on which type of commander they were assigned. The rotation system also meant that soldiers measured their time in country not by strategic goals, but by days remaining. The war became a personal countdown rather than a collective mission. Short-timers, those with fewer than 30 days left, were often excluded from dangerous patrols, creating a two-tier system where the newest arrivals bore the highest risk. The reliance on air power as a substitute for ground control produced massive ordnance expenditure with limited strategic effect. By 1968, more bombs had been dropped on Vietnam than were used in all of World War II. The bombing campaigns targeted supply routes, suspected base camps, and enemy troop concentrations. But the enemy adapted by moving at night, dispersing forces, and building extensive tunnel networks. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the primary supply route from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia, was bombed continuously for years. Entire sections were cratered, bridges were destroyed, and convoys were attacked from the air, but the flow of supplies never stopped. The trail was repaired faster than it could be destroyed, and alternative routes were established in parallel. The bombing created a logistical challenge for the enemy, but not an insurmountable one. Meanwhile, the cost in fuel, aircraft, and pilot lives was enormous. Some pilots flew hundreds of missions over the same sections of trail, watching the craters fill in and the truck traffic resume. The attitude toward Vietnamese civilians among American forces varied widely, but the operational environment discouraged empathy. Civilians lived in areas controlled by the enemy, provided food and labor to Viet Cong units, and sometimes participated in combat. Distinguishing between forced cooperation and willing support was nearly impossible. Some soldiers treated civilians with respect and tried to minimize harm. Others treated them with suspicion and indifference. A smaller number treated them with open hostility. The lack of language skills, cultural understanding, and clear rules of engagement made interactions unpredictable. Civilians who approached American patrols risked being perceived as threats. Civilians who avoided American patrols were assumed to be sympathetic to the enemy. The civilian population was caught between two forces, neither of which could guarantee their safety. Many Vietnamese families had members fighting on both sides, not out of ideology, but because survival required hedging. American forces operated in this environment without the tools or training to navigate it, and the result was a steady accumulation of resentment, mistakes, and atrocities that were neither anomalies nor official policy, but predictable outcomes of an unmanageable situation. The drug use among American soldiers in Vietnam escalated throughout the late 1960s and early 70s. Marijuana was widely available and commonly used. Heroin, which was cheap and potent in Southeast Asia, became a serious problem by 1970. Soldiers used drugs to manage fear, boredom, and disillusionment. Some used before patrols, others used after returning to base. The military's response was inconsistent, drug testing was limited, and enforcement was sporadic. Officers were aware of the problem but lacked the resources or authority to address it systematically. In some units, drug use was so widespread that it affected operational readiness, but reporting this would reflect poorly on command, so it was managed informally. Soldiers who became addicted were sometimes sent home early, sometimes reassigned, and sometimes ignored. The drug problem was not publicly acknowledged as a crisis until after the war, when tens of thousands of veterans returned with dependencies that had developed in country. The military treated it as a discipline issue rather than a symptom of a deteriorating mission. The concept of winning hearts and minds was central to counterinsurgency doctrine, but its implementation was superficial. Civil affairs units distributed food, provided medical care, and funded construction projects in rural areas. These efforts were genuine but limited. A medical team might treat patients in a village one day, and an artillery barrage might destroy the same village a week later because it was in a free-fire zone. Schools were built and then abandoned when security could not be maintained. Wells were dug in hamlets that were later forcibly relocated. The lack of continuity made the programs feel transactional rather than transformative. Vietnamese civilians accepted the aid because refusing it was dangerous, not because it changed their allegiance. The Viet Cong maintained influence through intimidation, taxation, and propaganda, but also through consistency. They did not rotate out after a year. They did not leave. American forces could not compete with that level of sustained presence, and the Hearts and Minds campaigns could not overcome the fundamental instability of the South Vietnamese government or the brutality of the war itself. The assassination of village officials suspected of collaborating with the Viet Cong was common, but so was the assassination of officials suspected of collaborating with the Americans. The Phoenix program targeted the former. The Viet Cong targeted the latter. Both sides used fear as a tool of control. A village chief who cooperated with the South Vietnamese government risked being killed by the Viet Cong. A village chief who refused to cooperate risked arrest or worse by Phoenix operatives. Some village chiefs tried to play both sides and were killed by one or the other when their duplicity was discovered. Others simply fled, leaving villages without functioning governance. In areas where local leadership collapsed, banditry and warlordism filled the void. The war created conditions where survival depended on reading the intentions of armed groups correctly, and the cost of misreading them was death. The Sun My Massacre, known publicly as My Lai, occurred in March 1968 when American soldiers killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians in a small hamlet. The operation was planned as a search and destroy mission targeting a Viet Cong battalion believed to be in the area. No enemy forces were encountered. The soldiers, members of Charlie Company, had suffered casualties from mines and snipers in previous weeks and were frustrated and angry. When they entered the hamlet, they began killing indiscriminately. Old men, women, children, and infants were shot. Some were gathered into groups and executed. Some were killed in their homes. A few soldiers refused to participate. One helicopter pilot, Hugh Thompson, intervened and stopped some of the killing by threatening to open fire on American troops if they continued. The massacre lasted several hours. Afterward, the initial reports described it as a successful engagement with over 100 enemy killed. The truth was suppressed for over a year until a former soldier, Ron Ridenhour, who had heard about the incident from participants, sent letters to Congress and the Pentagon demanding an investigation. When the story became public, it confirmed the worst fears about American conduct in Vietnam. The military prosecuted several soldiers. Only one, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted. He served 3.5 years under house arrest. The massacre was treated as an isolated atrocity, but it was not isolated. It was an extreme example of a pattern that occurred across the war in varying degrees. The use of white phosphorus, commonly called Willie Pete, was widespread. It was used to mark targets for airstrikes, to produce smoke screens, and as an incendiary weapon. White phosphorus burns intensely and sticks to skin, causing severe injuries. Its use against personnel was officially restricted, but the restrictions were not enforced. Units used it in situations where its anti-personnel effects were the desired outcome, not a side effect. The weapon left distinctive injuries that were difficult to treat. Victims often died from their wounds days or weeks later. The use of white phosphorus was not hidden, but it was also not advertised. After-action reports mentioned it casually as one tool among many. Photographs of its effects were taken but not widely published. It was part of the standard toolkit of a war that normalized extreme violence. The policy of forced relocation, known as the Strategic Hamlet Program in the early war, and later as population resettlement, aimed to isolate rural civilians from Viet Cong influence by moving them into fortified communities. The program was implemented inconsistently. Some hamlets were built with adequate resources and security. Others were little more than barbed wire enclosures with no infrastructure. Families were uprooted from ancestral lands and moved to unfamiliar areas where they had no means of livelihood. The South Vietnamese government administered the program, but American advisors planned and funded it. Many relocated civilians resented the forced displacement and viewed the new hamlets as internment camps. The Viet Cong infiltrated the hamlets easily because security was inadequate and because some of the relocated civilians were sympathetic or related to Viet Cong fighters. The program created more instability than it resolved, but it continued for years because it appeared to be a concrete action on paper. The practice of destroying crops and livestock to deny resources to the enemy affected civilians more than combatants. The Viet Cong operated in areas where they could requisition food from the population, but they were also mobile and could relocate when local resources were depleted. Civilians could not. When rice paddies were poisoned or livestock killed, the people who depended on them faced starvation or were forced to move. Some villages lost entire harvests. Some families lost their only source of protein. The destruction was documented in operational reports as resource denial, and its success was measured by the estimated tons of rice rendered unusable or the number of water buffalo killed. The human suffering was not measured. Refugees from these areas flooded into cities, creating slums and straining resources. The refugee crisis became another problem without a solution, and the people displaced by American tactics had little reason to support the government that displaced them. The failure to close the Cambodian and Laotian borders allowed the North Vietnamese to maintain sanctuaries beyond the reach of American ground forces. The Ho Chi Minh Trail ran through both countries, and North Vietnamese troops used Cambodian territory to rest, resupply, and plan operations. American commanders requested permission to conduct cross-border operations, but political considerations limited the response. Bombing campaigns hit targets in Laos and Cambodia, but these were conducted covertly and not acknowledged publicly. The secrecy meant that there was no public oversight and no accountability. The bombing of neutral countries was justified as necessary to disrupt enemy logistics, but it also destabilized those countries and contributed to the rise of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. When American ground forces finally entered Cambodia in 1970, the operation was brief, controversial, and had no lasting strategic impact. The sanctuaries remained functional, and the political cost of the incursion was severe. The gradual realization among soldiers that the war had no defined endpoint eroded morale more than casualties. Soldiers could accept risk if they believed it served a purpose. When the purpose became unclear, the risk felt meaningless. By 1969, many soldiers were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to survive their tour and protect the men next to them. Aggression declined. Patrols became cautious. Some units avoided contact when possible. The term search and evade emerged as a dark joke, describing missions where the goal was to appear active without engaging the enemy. Officers who pushed for aggressive action faced resistance, and in extreme cases they were targeted by their own men. Fragging, the use of fragmentation grenades to kill or intimidate unpopular officers, occurred with enough frequency that it became a recognized phenomenon. The exact number of fragging incidents is disputed, but it was significant enough that some officers slept with weapons and avoided certain soldiers. The breakdown of discipline and trust within units indicated that the war had lost internal coherence, even as it continued externally. The air war over North Vietnam, Operation Rolling Thunder and its successors, was constrained by political restrictions that limited its effectiveness. Targets had to be approved at high levels, and many strategically significant sites were off-limits due to fear of Chinese or Soviet intervention. Pilots flew into heavily defended airspace to strike targets of questionable value, while more important targets remained untouched. The restrictions frustrated aircrews who believed they were taking enormous risks for minimal gain. When the restrictions were lifted during the linebacker operations in 1972, the air campaign became more effective, but by then, the war was winding down, and the bombing was intended to support negotiations rather than achieve victory. The years of constrained bombing achieved little except the loss of hundreds of aircraft and pilots. The corruption within the South Vietnamese government and military undermined every American effort. American aid was siphoned off by officials at every level. Supplies intended for rural development were sold on the black market. Soldiers' pay was skimmed by officers. Positions in the government and military were bought and sold. The corruption was so pervasive that it became an accepted part of the system. American advisors reported it, but there was no mechanism to address it without alienating the very government the United States was supporting. The South Vietnamese leadership was more concerned with maintaining power than winning the war, and American support enabled them to do so without reform. The corruption demoralized South Vietnamese soldiers and alienated the population, making it nearly impossible to build a stable state capable of resisting the North. The use of chemical defoliants had unintended environmental consequences that were not fully understood during the war. Mangrove forests were destroyed and did not regenerate. Soil composition changed in sprayed areas, affecting agriculture for decades. Water sources were contaminated. The ecological damage compounded the human damage, and both were treated as externalities rather than central concerns. The military's focus was on immediate tactical advantage, not long-term impact. By the time the full scope of the damage became clear, the program had already been in operation for years. The policy of Vietnamization, introduced by President Nixon, aimed to transfer combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces while withdrawing American troops. The policy assumed that the South Vietnamese military could be trained and equipped to replace American forces. This assumption was optimistic. The South Vietnamese military had structural weaknesses that training could not fix. Leadership was based on loyalty rather than competence. Desertion rates were high, equipment was poorly maintained, morale was low. American advisors worked to improve performance, but the problems were systemic. When American forces began withdrawing, the South Vietnamese were left to fight a war they were not prepared to win. The Vietnamization policy allowed the United States to disengage while creating the appearance of continuity, but it did not change the outcome. It delayed the inevitable. The Christmas bombing of 1972, officially called Operation Linebacker 2, was an intensive 11-day air campaign against North Vietnam, intended to force concessions at the peace talks. B-52 bombers struck targets in Hanoi and Haiphong, and the bombing was the heaviest of the war. North Vietnamese air defenses shot down multiple aircraft, and American aircrew casualties were significant. The bombing achieved its immediate objective, in that the North Vietnamese returned to negotiations, but the resulting peace agreement was nearly identical to proposals that had been on the table for months. The bombing demonstrated American firepower, but also American desperation. It was a final display of force in a war that force alone could not resolve. The fall of Saigon in April 1975 occurred 2 years after American combat troops had withdrawn. The Paris Peace Accords signed in 1973 were supposed to establish a ceasefire, but the North Vietnamese never intended to honor it. They rebuilt their forces and launched a final offensive in early 1975. The South Vietnamese military collapsed rapidly. Units disintegrated. Soldiers abandoned their posts. Refugees flooded the roads. American personnel evacuated in chaos from the embassy rooftop, while crowds of Vietnamese who had worked with the Americans tried to escape. Helicopters ferried people to ships offshore. Some helicopters were pushed into the sea to make room for more landings. The images of the evacuation became the defining visual of the war's end. The United States had invested years, billions of dollars, and tens of thousands of lives, and the result was total defeat. The war did not end because a decision was made to stop. It ended because the side the United States supported ceased to exist. The legacy of the war was not reconciliation or understanding, but silence and bitterness. Veterans returned to a country that did not want to hear about their experiences. The government did not acknowledge responsibility for the failures. The South Vietnamese who had allied with the United States were abandoned to re-education camps and persecution. The boat people who fled Vietnam in the years after the war drowned by the thousands in the South China Sea. The environmental and health damage continued for generations. The war's lessons were debated endlessly, but the debates did not prevent similar mistakes in later conflicts. The Vietnam War demonstrated that a technologically superior military could not defeat an insurgency embedded in a population without destroying the population, and that even when destruction was pursued, it did not guarantee success. The war showed that metrics could not replace strategy, that air power could not replace political legitimacy, and that prolonged commitment without clear objectives eroded the forces making the commitment. These were not new lessons. They were relearned at great cost and then largely forgotten. By the time the last American helicopter left Saigon, over 58,000 American soldiers had died, along with hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese soldiers and uncounted North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters. Civilian deaths numbered in the millions. The country was devastated. The region was destabilized. The war achieved none of its stated objectives. South Vietnam fell. Communism spread to Laos and Cambodia. American credibility was damaged. The military was demoralized. And yet, for much of the war, official reports claimed progress. Commanders spoke of light at the end of the tunnel. Politicians promised that victory was achievable. The data said the enemy was weakening. The reality was that the war had become a self-perpetuating system that continued not because it was succeeding, but because stopping required admitting failure. And admitting failure was politically unacceptable until it became unavoidable. The soldiers who walked patrols in the jungle understood this long before the politicians did. They understood that the mission had dissolved, that the objectives were unclear, that the sacrifices were not building toward anything permanent. They continued anyway because orders continued, because rotations continued, because the machinery of war continued even after its purpose had been lost. The war did not end with a decision. It ended with exhaustion.